The storm raged harder than anyone expected that night. Sheets of rain lashed against the windshield as Matthew drove down the winding country road, his hands tight around the steering wheel. The radio crackled with weather warnings, but Matthew barely heard them over the sound of his own heartbeat. He wasn't supposed to be home this early. Meetings usually kept him until late. But something in his chest had told him to come back. Something only a father's heart can explain. The meeting had dragged on for hours. Quarterly reports spread across the conference table like scattered leaves. But Matthew couldn't focus. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted to his phone, checking for messages from Sarah. Nothing. The silence felt wrong somehow, like the eerie quiet before thunder strikes. "Matthew, are you with us?" his colleague had asked, noticing his distraction. That's when Matthew made the decision that would change everything. "I need to go home," he said, gathering his papers with shaking hands. "The girls. I need to check on my girls." As his headlights cut through the darkness, his breath caught in his throat. There, on the front porch of his own home, two tiny figures huddled together, soaked to the bone, their pajamas plastered to their shivering bodies. His twin daughters, only 6 years old, curled into each other for warmth, like two frightened kittens. Their hair clung wet against their pale cheeks, their little hands gripping tight, their eyes wide with fear the moment they recognized the glow of his car lights. The sight hit him like a physical blow. These were the same girls who should have been tucked safely in their beds, surrounded by stuffed animals and the warmth of their childhood room. Instead, they sat exposed to nature's fury, abandoned like unwanted packages left on a doorstep. "Daddy!" one of them cried out, her voice breaking as she stumbled to her feet. The sound of that word, "Daddy," spoken through chattering teeth and desperate hope, shattered something inside Matthew's chest. Matthew slammed the brakes, heart hammering against his ribs as he leapt from the truck. Rain drenched him instantly, but he didn't feel it. All he felt was the icy horror of seeing his little girls left outside in a storm that no child should endure. He swept them into his arms, holding them close, his lips trembling as he kissed their cold foreheads over and over. Their small bodies felt like ice against his chest. Naomi's lips had turned a frightening shade of blue, and Nia's entire frame shook with violent tremors. "My God, how long have you been out here?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "What happened? Who did this?" His voice cracked. The twins could barely form words through their chattering teeth. Naomi tried to speak but only managed broken syllables. Nia's eyes rolled back slightly, her body going limp from exhaustion and cold. Finally, Naomi whispered, "Daddy, we knew you'd come. Aunt Sarah told us not to tell." The words hit Matthew like lightning. Sarah, his own sister, the one he had trusted to care for them while he worked, the woman who had promised she would love them like her own. Matthew's stomach dropped. The headlights reflected the truth in their little eyes. This wasn't the first time. He could see it now, the way they flinched slightly when he moved too quickly, the way they seemed smaller somehow, as if they'd been learning to make themselves invisible. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm rising in his chest. He wrapped them in the emergency blanket from his truck, shielding their fragile bodies as thunder shook the sky. He pressed their heads against his chest, whispering, "You're safe now. Daddy's here. I'll never let anyone hurt you again." But his eyes drifted to the house, the same house where his late wife's laughter once filled the halls. Tonight it stood dark and quiet except for a faint glow in the upstairs window. Through the noise of the storm, he thought he heard something. Laughter. Not the innocent laughter of children, but the careless, sharp laughter of adults who felt no shame. And in that moment, as his daughters clung to him in tears, Matthew realized his life, his family, and his trust in blood itself would never be the same again. Because what waited behind that door wasn't just neglect. It was betrayal by the very person he thought he could depend on the most. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. To understand the betrayal that shattered Matthew's family, You have to know Sarah Whitman. Sarah had always been the eldest, the one their parents put on a pedestal. But her pedestal had cracked long ago. At 42, she had watched her younger brother build everything she had failed to achieve. Failed relationships, a stalled career, and a life filled with bitterness left her watching her younger brother Matthew with resentment. Because while she stumbled, Matthew built something she could never understand. A family rooted in love. But Sarah never approved of that family. From the moment Matthew introduced Emily, the beautiful black woman who would become his wife, Sarah's disdain was clear. She remembered that first dinner, how Emily had walked into their childhood home with confidence and grace, her hand intertwined with Matthew's. Sarah had watched from the kitchen doorway as their parents embraced Emily warmly, welcoming her with genuine affection. That night, Sarah cornered Matthew in the hallway. "Do you know what you're doing?" she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. "The neighbors will talk. The family name will be fine," Matthew had interrupted, but Sarah's poison was already spreading. She smiled politely at family dinners, but behind closed doors she sneered. "You could have had anyone, Matthew," she once hissed, "and this is who you chose. Do you even realize what people are saying?" At Matthew and Emily's wedding, Sarah stood as the maid of honor, her smile frozen in place as she watched her brother kiss his bride. That night she went home and stared at herself in the mirror, wondering why her own life felt so empty while Matthew's overflowed with joy. The jealousy festered like an infected wound. When Naomi and Nia were born, tiny, bright-eyed biracial girls who carried their mother's smile, Sarah's bitterness grew into something cruel. She would visit the hospital and hold the babies with stiff arms, her face a mask of politeness while other relatives cooed with genuine delight. "They don't look like Whitmans," she said more than once, her lips curling. "They'll never belong here." Emily had heard those words, filed them away as warning signals. She tried to limit Sarah's time with the girls, but Matthew always defended his sister. "She means well," he would say, not seeing the way Sarah's eyes followed his daughter's with barely concealed disdain. Matthew always brushed it off. "She's just old-fashioned," he'd say to Emily. But Emily knew better. She kept a journal, documenting the subtle cruelties, the backhanded comments, the way Sarah's face would twist when the twins laughed too loudly or spoke about their mixed heritage with innocent pride. Emily's last entry, written just weeks before the accident that took her life, read, "Sarah is dangerous, not in an obvious way, but in the way that poison works slowly. I pray Matthew sees it before it's too late." And after Emily's death, Sarah's prejudice came cloaked in something more dangerous: authority. At the funeral, Sarah wrapped her arms around Matthew and promised, "I'll help raise them. I'll be here for you." Everyone praised her devotion. Neighbors said Matthew was lucky to have such a sister. The pastor spoke of family bonds and Christian duty. But what they didn't know was that Sarah wasn't helping out of love. She was taking control. Sarah moved into the guest room that very week, bringing suitcases full of rules and rigid expectations. "Those girls need structure," she declared, hanging her clothes in Emily's former closet space. Emily was too soft with them, too permissive. The transformation began immediately. At first, the twins thought Aunt Sarah was simply strict, but strict turned into cruel. When Naomi ran to her with a drawing of her late mother, Sarah snatched it and tore it in half. "Stop clinging to her. She's gone. And don't you dare bring those pictures out when people visit. You'll embarrass the family." The pieces of the drawing fluttered to the floor like broken dreams. Naomi knelt to gather them, tears streaming down her face as she tried to piece together her mother's smile. When Nia whispered a bedtime prayer for her mother, Sarah slapped the pillow beside her and said, "Your mother's not here. I am. Learn to respect me." The girls began to walk on eggshells, their natural childhood joy dampened by the constant threat of Sarah's disapproval. Breakfast became a minefield. If they spoke too loudly, Sarah would slam her coffee cup down. If they left crumbs, she would make them scrub the entire table while berating them. "Messy, just like your mother," she would mutter under her breath. The girls were only 6 years old. too young to understand why the woman who called herself family treated them like burdens, too innocent to recognize that Sarah's cruelty stemmed from a hatred that had nothing to do with their behavior and everything to do with the color of their skin and the memory of their mother. Matthew never saw it. He left early for work, trusted Sarah's reports when he returned home. The girls were difficult today, Sarah would say with practiced concern. I had to discipline them. To him, Sarah played the role of the selfless aunt. In front of others, she braided the girls' hair, smiled for photos, and carried herself like a savior. She spoke at church about the burden of raising her brother's children, how she had sacrificed her own life to help family in need. But the moment the doors closed, her mask dropped. "You're lucky your father keeps you," she would whisper. "If it were up to me, you'd be somewhere else." The psychological torture was methodical. Sarah knew exactly how to break down two grieving 6-year-olds without leaving physical marks. She would serve them smaller portions at dinner, claiming they needed to learn portion control. When they asked for seconds, she would shake her head. "Your mother spoiled you. In this house we earn our food." She moved their mother's pictures to higher shelves, just out of reach. When the girls asked to see them, she would sigh dramatically. "Again? Can't you think about anything else?" The cruelty wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was silence. She ignored them at dinner, refused to answer their questions, rolled her eyes when they asked for comfort. When they scraped their knees, she would hand them a bandage without a word of comfort. When they had nightmares, she would call through the door, "Go back to sleep. I'm not coming." And when they cried, she mocked them. "Pathetic, just like your mother. You think you're special? You're not even real Whitmans. No wonder your father's tired all the time. He's stuck with you." The girls began to believe her words. They started apologizing for everything, for breathing too loudly, for existing in Sarah's space, for having their mother's features reflected in their faces. Little by little, Sarah broke them down, gaslighting, mocking, punishing them for the very heritage that gave them their identity. She would tell Matthew they were being difficult when they asked about their mother. She would report their disobedience when they tried to pray before meals. She painted them as problems that needed fixing, rather than children who needed love. And though Matthew couldn't see it yet, his daughters were learning to hide their tears in corners, clutching each other at night, whispering prayers to the mother they lost. They developed their own secret language of survival. Hand squeezes that meant, "Stay quiet." Shared glances that said, "It will be okay." They became each other's lifeline in a house that had turned against them. Because to Sarah, their greatest sin wasn't disobedience. It was simply being who they were. Children who reminded her every day of the black woman she never wanted in her family. The storm had rolled in fast that evening, thunder growling low, lightning splitting the sky, rain hammering the roof, like a warning no one could ignore. The weather reports had been talking about it all day, but no one expected it to hit with such vengeance. Inside the Whitman home, Sarah's patience had worn thin. It had been one of those days when everything the girls did seemed to irritate her. Naomi had spilled orange juice at breakfast. Nia had asked 3 times when Daddy would be home. They had played too loudly in the afternoon, their laughter echoing through the halls like an accusation. By evening, Sarah's nerves were frayed. She paced the living room like a caged animal, checking her watch every few minutes. Matthew's meeting was running late, and she was trapped with the 2 children she had grown to despise. When bedtime came, the girls asked for their usual routine, a story, a song, a moment to look at their mother's picture, simple requests that any loving caretaker would honor. But Sarah saw it as defiance. Naomi had asked for one more bedtime story, clutching the worn picture of her late mother. "Please, Aunt Sarah, just the one about the princess who looked like Mama?" Nia had whispered a prayer, her small voice trembling in the quiet. "God bless Daddy and God bless Mama in heaven and help Aunt Sarah be happy." That was all it took. Sarah's eyes snapped with fury. Enough, she hissed, yanking the picture from Naomi's hand and tossing it onto the floor. The frame cracked, spider webbing across Emily's smiling face. Do you think your mother's coming back? She's dead. And you two need to stop living in the past. The girls froze, their tiny bodies stiff with fear. But Sarah wasn't finished. The words poured out of her like poison from a broken bottle, years of resentment finally finding their target. You don't belong here, she spat, her voice rising with each word. Look at you, dark skin, curly hair, reminding everyone that Matthew ruined this family by marrying your mother. You're not Whitman's. You're reminders of his mistake. Naomi's lip quivered. Please, Aunt Sarah, we just— Shut up, Sarah snapped. She grabbed them both by the arms, her fingers digging into their soft skin hard enough to leave marks. If you won't listen, you can learn the hard way. She dragged them down the hall, past family photos where their mother's face smiled down at them, past the door to their father's room where he should have been to protect them. The front door swung open, and a blast of icy rain swept inside. Sarah shoved Naomi and Naya out onto the porch, their bare feet slipping on the wet wood. The girls stumbled, clutching each other as thunder cracked overhead like the world itself was breaking apart. Sit out here until you learn respect, Sarah barked, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Maybe the storm will teach you better than I can. Please, Naomi cried, reaching back toward the door. We're sorry, we'll be good. But Sarah's face was stone. You should have thought of that before disrespecting me in my own house. The door slammed. The sound echoed like a gunshot, final and merciless. Inside, Sarah turned the lock with a sharp click, then walked calmly back to the living room. She poured herself a glass of wine, settled into Matthew's favorite chair, and turned on the television as if nothing had happened. Outside, 2 6-year-old girls faced the fury of nature, abandoned by the very person who was supposed to protect them. Naomi and Nia huddled together in the corner of the porch, their pajamas plastered to their small frames. Water streamed down their faces, mixing with tears. They clutched each other tight, whispering through chattering teeth. The porch offered little shelter. Wind drove the rain sideways, soaking them completely within minutes. Lightning illuminated their terror in stark, brief moments, 2 small silhouettes against the vastness of the storm. I'm scared, Naya whimpered, her voice barely audible above the thunder. Me too, Naomi whispered back, pulling her sister closer. But Daddy will come. He always comes home. Their faith in their father was the only warmth they had. Why doesn't she love us? Nia whimpered. She's wrong, Naomi whispered back, her voice breaking. We do belong. Daddy loves us. Mama loved us. We're not a mistake. But their words were fragile against the roar of the storm. They tried to remember their mother's voice, the songs she used to sing when thunder scared them. Emily would gather them in her arms and say, "Thunder is just the sky's way of applauding the lightning show." But tonight, there was no comfort, no warm embrace. Just 2 children clinging to each other as the world raged around them. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. The rain soaked their hair, their hands trembled with cold, their lips turned blue. Naomi felt Nia's body growing heavier against her, and panic rose in her small chest. Stay awake, she whispered urgently. Daddy's coming, stay awake. They were just 6 years old. 2 innocent girls abandoned not by strangers, but by blood. And that's when headlights appeared. A truck pulled into the driveway, its beams slicing through the storm like salvation itself. The brakes screeched, the door flew open, and Matthew Whitman leapt out into the rain. His heart nearly stopped at the sight before him. His daughters, his little Naomi and Nia, huddled on the porch, drenched, shivering, eyes wide with terror. The scene burned itself into his memory forever. This moment would replay in his mind for years to come, the moment he realized he had failed to protect the most precious things in his world. He scooped them up, pulling their soaked bodies into his chest, his voice cracking. Oh God, my babies. What happened? Who did this to you? Their skin was ice cold, their lips blue, their tiny bodies shaking uncontrollably. Naomi's teeth chattered as she whispered, "Daddy, we knew you would come back. She told us not to tell." And in that moment, Matthew understood. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that had been raging inside his home all along. He wrapped them in the emergency blanket from his truck, kissed their wet hair, and whispered, "You're safe now. I promise, you're safe." Then he turned toward the front door, his face hardening, the rage rising in his chest like the thunder above. Because what waited inside that house would shatter everything. Matthew stormed into the house, rain dripping from his clothes, his daughter's cries still echoing in his ears. The contrast hit him immediately. The warm, dry interior where Sarah sat comfortably while his children had been left to face nature's fury. Sarah was standing by the fireplace, sipping wine as though nothing had happened. She looked up with mild annoyance as if Matthew had interrupted her peaceful evening. "Oh, you're home early," she said casually, swirling the wine in her glass. "You?" Matthew's voice thundered, low and shaking with fury. "Left my daughters outside in the storm." Sarah barely flinched. She set her glass down on the mantel with deliberate slowness, her movements calculated to show how little his anger affected her. She smirked. "Don't be dramatic, it was just a little rain. Maybe now they'll learn to behave." The casual cruelty in her voice, the complete lack of remorse, sent Matthew's blood pressure soaring. Matthew's fists clenched. "They're 6 years old, Sarah. 6. And you call that discipline? You call abandoning children discipline?" "Oh, please." Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You coddled them. Emily coddled them. Someone has to teach them reality." "Reality?" Matthew stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The reality is that you put 2 children's lives at risk because of your own twisted hatred." "They're not children," Sarah snapped, her mask of calm cracking. The wine had loosened her tongue, and years of suppressed hatred came pouring out. "They're stains, proof of your mistake, reminders of the woman you never should have married. We all told you, Matthew. You ruined this family when you brought her into it. And now we're stuck with them, those little half-breeds who don't belong in this house." The words hung heavy in the air, cutting through Matthew like knives. In that moment he saw Sarah clearly for the first time, not as his protective older sister, but as a woman consumed by racial hatred and jealousy. He stepped closer, his eyes burning. "Don't you ever call them that again?" But Sarah only sneered, emboldened by his pain. "What will you do, Matthew? Protect them? You never see what they really are. Weak, whining, just like their mother. If Emily hadn't died, she would have dragged you down too. I'm doing you a favor by teaching them their place." "Their place?" Matthew's voice rose. "Their place is as my daughters, my flesh and blood, my everything." "Your everything?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Look what they've done to you. You used to be ambitious, driven. Now you rush home early from meetings to check on 2 little girls who will never appreciate what you sacrifice for them." Matthew's voice dropped, ice cold. "Their place is in this home. Their place is by my side. And your place is in hell for what you've done." The legal battle that followed became the talk of the county. Matthew didn't just file charges, he built a case. He hired the best family attorney in the state, documented every incident he could remember, reached out to teachers and neighbors who had witnessed Sarah's treatment of the girls. The weeks that followed became a battle line. Matthew filed charges, not just for child neglect but for emotional abuse. He also filed for a restraining order, ensuring Sarah could never come near his daughters again. Sarah fought back with everything she had. She hired her own lawyer, claiming Matthew was having a breakdown. That grief had made him paranoid and unfit as a father. She painted herself as the victim, the devoted sister who had sacrificed her own life to help her brother, only to be falsely accused when her grief-stricken brother snapped. And when the courtroom filled, Sarah came dressed in her best: pearls, tailored suit, a practiced smile that screamed innocence. She looked every inch the respectable woman, the kind of person judges and juries trusted instinctively. Her testimony was masterful in its deception. She lied with ease. "I love those girls. I would never harm them. They were just playing outside. Their father misunderstood. I moved in to help my grieving brother," she told the court, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "Those poor children lost their mother, and I couldn't bear to see them struggle. I gave up my own apartment, my own life, to be there for them." She painted Naomi and Naya as confused children, traumatized by their mother's death and unable to distinguish between discipline and abuse. "Children that age," she said sadly. "They don't always understand when adults are trying to help them." For a moment, it seemed her performance might work. Some jurors nodded sympathetically. The judge leaned forward with interest. But then came Naomi and Nia. Tiny voices, trembling but steady, stood before the judge. The courtroom fell silent as the two girls approached the witness stand. They looked impossibly small in the large courtroom, their hands clasped together for strength. "She told us we didn't belong," Naomi whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of truth. "She said Daddy made a mistake by loving Mama," Naya added, her small hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "She tore up our picture of Mama and said she was embarrassing," Naomi continued, tears starting to fall. "She locked us outside in the rain," Naya finished, her voice growing stronger with each word. The prosecution was gentle but thorough. "Naomi, can you tell us what Aunt Sarah said about your skin color?" Naomi looked down at her hands. She said we were dark and didn't look like real Whitmans." "Nia, did Aunt Sarah ever compare you to your mother?" "She said we were weak and whiny like Mama. She said Mama was a mistake." The room fell silent. Each word from the children hit like a hammer blow. Their innocence, their obvious truth, their trembling voices. No jury could doubt what they had endured. A teacher testified about the girls' sudden silence in class, the way they flinched when spoken to harshly. They went from bright, talkative children to withdrawn and fearful almost overnight, she said. "I documented my concerns but didn't know who to contact." A neighbor recalled seeing the twins alone outside before, always looking scared when Sarah appeared. "I thought it was odd," the elderly woman testified, but Sarah always had an explanation. She said they were being punished for misbehavior. The school counselor took the stand with heartbreaking testimony. Naomi drew pictures of herself and her sister standing in the rain. When I asked her about it, she said, "This is where bad girls have to stay." Piece by piece, Sarah's lies unraveled. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic emotional abuse, racially motivated cruelty, and deliberate endangerment. Finally, Matthew stood. His voice was steady, his anger controlled, his truth undeniable. "My daughters lost their mother when they were 3. All they had left was me, and this house. I let Sarah in because I believed family would protect family. Instead, she turned their home into a prison of shame. She mocked their skin, she mocked their mother's memory, and she mocked their very existence. These girls are my life, and no one, not even blood, has the right to strip them of their dignity." His voice broke slightly as he continued. "I trusted her with the most precious things in my world. I worked extra hours believing they were safe and loved. Instead, they were being tortured by someone who was supposed to be family." Sarah's face drained of color. Her pearls suddenly felt like shackles, her pride shrinking under the weight of testimony she couldn't twist. Her lawyer made one final attempt, claiming mental health issues, asking for counseling instead of prison time. But the judge had heard enough. The judge's gavel struck. "Sarah Whitman, you are guilty of child neglect and emotional abuse. The court finds that your actions were not only criminal, but were motivated by racial bias and personal jealousy. You are hereby sentenced to 10 years in prison. May this serve as a lesson. Cruelty against innocence will not go unpunished." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Sarah's supporters, the few who remained, sat in stunned silence. Naomi and Nia clung to their father, relief flooding their little faces. For the first time in years, Matthew knew his home could finally heal. And Sarah? Her downfall wasn't just in the sentence, it was in the whispers that followed her as she was led away. The family name she had tried to protect was now forever stained, not by the children she hated, but by the cruelty she chose. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Sarah finally understood the magnitude of her loss. She had traded everything, her freedom, her reputation, her family, for the satisfaction of hurting two innocent children. When the courtroom emptied, Matthew held Naomi and Nia close, feeling their small hearts beating against his chest. For weeks, those tiny hearts had been wrapped in fear, but now, for the first time, they beat with relief. He whispered into their hair, "You're safe now. Daddy will never let anyone hurt you again." The girls looked up at him, their eyes still carrying shadows of the storm. Nia asked quietly, "Is Aunt Sarah gone forever?" Matthew's throat tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, she can't touch you anymore." Outside, the reporters swarmed, hungry for a headline. Camera crews lined the courthouse steps, microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Mr. Whitman, how do you feel about your sister's sentence? Will you be pressing civil charges? What do you want other families to know?" But Matthew shielded the twins with his coat and walked past them, not answering a single question. Justice wasn't a spectacle to him. It was a promise kept. The drive home was quiet except for the steady rhythm of windshield wipers. In the rearview mirror, Matthew watched his daughters hold hands, their fingers intertwined like they had been through every trial. "Are we really safe now, Daddy?" Naomi asked softly. "Forever and always," Matthew promised, his voice steady for their sake even as his heart still raced with the memory of finding them in that storm. Back at the house, silence replaced Sarah's cruelty. The walls that once echoed with insults and mockery were now filled with bedtime stories, whispered prayers, and laughter that began cautiously, then grew bolder with each passing day. Matthew removed every trace of Sarah's presence, her clothes, her books, her bitter energy. He redecorated the guest room as a reading nook where the girls could curl up with books about princesses who looked like them. Naomi and Nia drew pictures again. Only this time the paper showed 3 figures. Daddy in the middle, holding their hands, all of them smiling under a bright sun. Their late mother Emily still appeared in angel wings above, reminding them of a love that never faded. They hung their mother's pictures at their eye level again, kissing her image goodnight each evening. But healing wasn't instant. Sometimes at night, Naomi would wake crying, remembering Sarah's sharp words. Sometimes Nia would flinch when someone raised their voice too quickly. The trauma had left invisible scars that would take time to fade. Matthew never ignored it. He sat with them, held their hands, and said, "You are loved. You belong. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." He read books about trauma, consulted child psychologists, learned how to help his daughters rebuild their sense of safety and self-worth. Slowly, the fear began to loosen its grip. At school, their teachers noticed the change. Naomi answered questions with more confidence, her soft voice steady. Nia started drawing again, filling the art board with bold colors instead of gray shadows. Friends who had once whispered about their sadness now laughed with them on the playground. And Matthew? He carried guilt. Guilt for not seeing the cruelty sooner. Guilt for trusting blood over his daughter's quiet pleas. But instead of drowning in it, he let it drive him. He became not just their father, but their fiercest protector. He rearranged his business hours, made sure he was home for breakfast, homework, and bedtime stories. He learned to braid hair clumsily, to pack lunches with notes that read, "Daddy loves you." He installed security cameras, changed the locks, and made sure his daughters knew they could call him anytime, anywhere, for any reason. One Sunday morning, as rain pattered gently against the windows, Naomi curled against him and whispered, "Daddy, It doesn't feel scary anymore. That single sentence was worth more than any courtroom victory. It was proof that love had outlived. You carry the best of both worlds, Matthew would tell them. That makes you stronger, not weaker. And it was about love. The love of a mother, Emily, whose memory carried her daughters through the darkest nights. The love of a father, Matthew, who chose them over pride, over silence, over family pressure. The kind of love that heals wounds no storm can wash away. 3 years later, when Sarah was eligible for her first parole hearing, she sat across from a board of officers and tried to explain her remorse. I was grieving too, she said, her voice smaller than it had ever been. I lost my brother's wife and I handled it wrong. But the parole board had read the case files. They had seen the photos of 2 6-year-old girls huddled in a storm. They had read the psychological evaluations detailing the lasting trauma Sarah had inflicted. Mrs. Whitman, the board chairman said sternly, your actions weren't grief. They were deliberate cruelty motivated by racial hatred. You targeted children because of the color of their skin and their deceased mother's race. Parole denied. Sarah would serve her full sentence, and by the time she was released, Naomi and Nia would be teenagers. Strong, confident young women who had learned that their worth came from within, not from the approval of those who sought to diminish them. So when the community whispered about the scandal, about Sarah's sentence, about the shame that clung to the Whitman name, Matthew didn't care. His daughters laughed again. That was victory enough. On quiet evenings, when the girls were doing homework at the kitchen table, Matthew would watch them and marvel at their resilience. Naomi had become the family's little protector, always checking on her sister, always ready with a hug when needed. Nia had developed an artist's eye, seeing beauty in everything around her, turning pain into colorful masterpieces. Both girls spoke about their mother with love instead of sadness, keeping Emily's memory alive through stories and traditions. They had not just survived Sarah's cruelty, they had transcended it. Matthew kept Emily's journal, the one where she had documented her concerns about Sarah. Sometimes he would read her words and feel the weight of what might have been prevented if he had listened sooner. But he also saw Emily's wisdom in every decision he made now, her emphasis on love over fear, acceptance over judgment, family over prejudice. The house that had once echoed with Sarah's hatred now rang with laughter, music lessons, and friends coming over to play. Matthew had learned to braid hair properly, to paint tiny fingernails, to answer questions about growing up with grace and honesty. When the girls asked about discrimination they might face, he didn't shy away from difficult conversations. Some people, he explained, carry hatred in their hearts. But that hatred says nothing about you and everything about them. You are beautiful, brilliant, and loved exactly as you are. The twins grew stronger, not in spite of what they had endured, but because they had faced it together and emerged with their spirits intact. And on stormy nights, when thunder rolled across the sky, instead of fear, they felt gratitude. Remember when we sat in the rain? Nia would say to her sister. And Daddy came to save us, Naomi would finish. He always comes when we need him, they would say together, safe in the knowledge that some promises never break. The storm that nearly destroyed them had become the foundation of their unshakable bond, with each other, with their father, and with the memory of a mother whose love had taught them they belonged everywhere they chose to be. What would you have done if it were your children? Would you have forgiven Sarah or stood your ground like Matthew did? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so others can feel the power of justice and love too.